Steve Harvey was used to contestants recognizing him. People shouted his name, repeated lines from his comedy specials, and told him they had watched Family Feud with their parents and grandparents for years. But on one unforgettable afternoon, a contestant was not looking at Steve. 47-year-old Daniel Brooks stood behind the Brooks family podium, staring across the stage at a woman from the opposing team. The woman's name was Helen Morales. She was 68 years old, with short silver hair, warm brown eyes, and a small crescent-shaped mark near her left eyebrow. Helen had been smiling only moments earlier. Now she was looking back at Daniel with growing confusion. Steve noticed that Daniel had stopped listening to the question. "Daniel," Steve said, waving the card in front of him, "you still with us?" Daniel did not respond. His hands began to shake. He stepped away from the podium and pointed toward Helen. The audience became quiet. Steve looked from Daniel to Helen. "You know this lady?" he asked. Daniel swallowed hard. He had not seen Helen in 38 years. For most of his life, he had believed he would never see her again. He looked directly into her eyes and spoke 4 words. "You saved my life." The studio fell completely silent. Helen's smile disappeared. Her hand rose to her mouth. Steve slowly lowered his question card. No one in the audience understood what had just happened, but Daniel did. He recognized the woman who had entered a burning apartment building when everyone else was running out. He recognized the woman who had wrapped him in her own coat, carried him through smoke, and disappeared before he ever learned her full name. And to understand why this reunion brought 2 families together on national television, you have to go back to a freezing night in Newark, New Jersey, nearly 4 decades earlier. Daniel Brooks was 9 years old when his life changed. At that time, he lived with his mother, Lorraine, and his 5-year-old sister, Kayla, in a small 3rd-floor apartment. Lorraine worked nights cleaning offices in downtown Newark. She left home shortly before 6 every evening and returned after midnight. The family did not have much money, but Lorraine worked hard to make their apartment feel safe. She covered the old walls with family photographs. She kept fresh flowers in a glass jar near the kitchen window. Every Friday, even when money was tight, she brought home a small treat for the children. Sometimes it was ice cream. Sometimes it was a comic book for Daniel and colored pencils for Kayla. Lorraine often reminded her children that being poor was not the same as being without value. "Money tells you what you can buy," she said. "It does not tell you who you are." Daniel remembered those words for the rest of his life. He was a quiet child who loved drawing buildings. He spent hours creating imaginary houses with wide windows, strong doors, and large kitchens where families could eat together. Kayla usually sat beside him and added flowers to his drawings. Their apartment building was old. The hallway lights often failed, the windows allowed cold air inside, and several smoke detectors did not work properly. Tenants complained repeatedly. The owner promised repairs but rarely completed them. Lorraine saved copies of every written complaint. She worried about the exposed wires in the hallway and the old heating system in the basement. But moving was expensive, and the family had nowhere else to go. Helen Morales lived in the building across the street. She was 30 years old then, raising 2 young sons by herself while working as a nursing assistant. Helen was the kind of neighbor who noticed things. She noticed when elderly people needed help carrying groceries. She noticed when a child waited alone at a bus stop. Family had not opened its curtains for several days. Helen had grown up in a close Puerto Rican household where neighbors were treated like relatives. Her mother always said, "A street becomes a community when people stop pretending not to see each other." Helen lived by that lesson. She knew Lorraine from the neighborhood. They were not close friends, but they greeted each other outside the buildings and occasionally shared coffee. Helen had watched Daniel and Kayla play on the sidewalk. She knew Daniel was protective of his little sister. She also knew Lorraine worried about leaving the children during the early part of her night shift. A teenage neighbor usually stayed with them until Lorraine returned. But on one bitterly cold evening in January, the babysitter called to say she was sick. Lorraine tried to find someone else. No one was available. She considered missing work, but her supervisor had already warned that another absence could cost her the job. Lorraine cooked dinner, reviewed the emergency rules with Daniel, and told him not to open the door for anyone. Daniel was only 9, but he had cared for Kayla before. Lorraine promised she would return as early as possible. Before leaving, she kissed both children. Then she pointed toward the telephone. "If anything feels wrong, you call me." "The police or Mistress Carter downstairs." Daniel nodded. "I can handle it." Lorraine touched his face. "You are responsible, but you are still a child." Do not try to be a grown man when you need help, Daniel promised. It was the last conversation he had with his mother before the fire. At approximately 9:30 that night, a damaged electrical wire inside the second-floor hallway began producing sparks. Several residents later said they had smelled something burning earlier in the evening. The building's alarm system did not activate. The fire spread into the wall and reached the wooden staircase. By the time smoke entered the upper apartments, the main exit was already becoming dangerous. Daniel was drawing at the kitchen table when Kayla said her eyes hurt. He looked toward the hallway and saw gray smoke moving beneath the apartment door. At first, he froze. Then he remembered his mother's instructions. He picked up the telephone. The line was dead. He opened the window and shouted for help. Cold air entered the room, but the street below seemed far away. Daniel tried the front door. The metal knob was hot. He pulled his hand back. Kayla began crying. I want mommy. Daniel wanted his mother, too. Instead, he told his sister to stay low. He pushed towels beneath the door and led her toward the bedroom window, which faced the rear alley. The window had been painted shut. Daniel pulled until his fingers hurt. It would not open. Smoke continued filling the apartment. Across the street, Helen Morales had just returned from work. She was removing her coat when she noticed orange light reflecting against her living room wall. She looked outside and saw flames in the apartment building. People were running into the street. Some were shouting that children lived on the third floor. Helen knew immediately which children they meant. She ran downstairs without stopping to change her nursing uniform. Outside, several residents were calling emergency services. The front entrance was already filled with smoke. A man tried to prevent Helen from entering. The stairs are burning, he said. There are children up there. The fire department is coming. Helen looked at the third-floor window. She could see a small hand striking the glass. Waiting did not feel like an option. Behind the building, an exterior service staircase reached the second floor. From there, a narrow metal ladder led toward the upper fire escape. The ladder was old and partly covered with ice. Helen climbed it. People below shouted for her to stop. She continued. When she reached the third-floor landing, crying inside, Helen wrapped her hand in her coat and struck the bedroom window with a loose piece of metal. The first hit cracked the glass. The second opened a hole. Daniel used a chair from inside to break away more of the window. Helen climbed through. Smoke covered the ceiling. Daniel was lying on the floor beside his sister. Helen recognized him immediately. Daniel, it's Miss Helen from across the street. He looked at her through watering eyes. My sister can't breathe. Helen removed her coat, wrapped it around Kayla, and lifted the child. Stay behind me, she told Daniel. They moved toward the broken window. The flames had not yet reached the bedroom, but the smoke was becoming thicker. Helen climbed out with Kayla. Daniel followed. As they reached the metal landing, part of the window frame collapsed behind them. Daniel slipped. Helen grabbed the back of his shirt with one hand while holding Kayla with the other. For several seconds, Daniel's feet hung above the alley. Helen pulled him onto the landing. The fire escape shook beneath their weight. She pushed Kayla into Daniel's arms and guided both children down. When they reached the second-floor platform, firefighters were entering the alley. They brought the children to the ground. Daniel remembered coughing. He remembered red lights turning in the smoke. He remembered Helen kneeling beside him and removing a small chain from around her neck. Attached to the chain was a medal of St. Christopher, a symbol her mother had given her for protection. Helen placed it in Daniel's palm. You are safe now, she said. Daniel held the medal tightly. Then everything became dark. He woke in a hospital. Kayla was in another room receiving treatment for smoke inhalation. Daniel's aunt sat beside his bed. The first person he asked about was his mother. No one answered immediately. Lorraine had left work as soon as she heard about the fire. She was traveling home in a coworker's car when another vehicle lost control on the icy road. The crash killed her instantly. Daniel and Kayla lost their home and their mother on the same night. Helen had saved them from the fire, but she never learned about Lorraine's accident until later. After rescuing the children, Helen was treated for burns and smoke inhalation. Her sons were frightened by what she had done. Her older son asked why she had risked leaving them without a mother. Helen struggled to answer. I heard those children crying, she finally said. In that moment, I could not pretend they belonged to someone else. Daniel remained in the hospital for several days. He asked repeatedly to see the woman who saved him, but the city was dealing with the aftermath of the fire. Families had been moved to different shelters, reporters were asking questions, and records were confused. Helen visited the hospital once, but Daniel was asleep. She left a short note with a nurse. The note never reached him. After his release, Daniel and Kayla moved to North Carolina with their mother's older sister, Patricia. The move happened quickly. The children owned almost nothing. The apartment, family photographs, school records, and Lorraine's saved complaints had been destroyed. Daniel carried only a donated bag of clothing and Helen's medal. He did not know her last name. He knew her only as Miss Helen from across the street. As the years passed, details of the fire became less clear. Daniel remembered smoke, broken glass, and a woman wearing a blue nursing uniform. He remembered the mark near her eyebrow. He remembered her voice saying, "You are safe now." Most of all, he remembered her hands. They had been burned while pulling him through the window. At night, Daniel imagined finding her. He wanted to thank her. He wanted her to know that the frightened boy she carried out of the building had survived. But in the years before social media and online databases, finding one woman was almost impossible. Aunt Patricia raised Daniel and Kayla with discipline and love. She had 3 children of her own, but she made room for 2 more. The house became crowded. Money became even tighter. Patricia never allowed Daniel to believe he was a burden. "Your mother was my sister," she told him. "Her children are my children." Still, Daniel carried a heavy sense of responsibility. He had failed to save the apartment. He had failed to make the telephone work. He had failed to protect Kayla without Helen's help. Adults told him none of those things were his fault. But guilt does not always listen to reason. Daniel became obsessed with safety. He checked locks several times before sleeping. He tested smoke detectors every month. He refused to light candles. Whenever he entered a building, he noticed the exits. At school, teachers discovered his talent for drawing structures. One teacher encouraged him to study architecture. Daniel eventually chose fire protection engineering instead. He wanted to understand why buildings failed and how people could be protected. He earned scholarships, worked nights, and became the first person in his family to graduate from college. He later married a teacher named Angela. They had 2 daughters. Daniel installed more safety equipment in their home than local regulations required. Angela joked that the house could survive an attack from outer space, but she understood the fear behind his careful behavior. Daniel told her about the fire, his mother, and the unknown woman who saved him. He showed her the St. Christopher medal. The medal had darkened with age, but he still kept it in a small wooden box. Every January, on the anniversary of the fire, Daniel placed the medal beside a photograph of his mother. He thanked Lorraine for the life she gave him. Then he thanked Miss Helen for allowing that life to continue. He made several attempts to find her. He contacted old newspapers, fire departments, and hospitals. He visited Newark and stood where the apartment building had once been. A newer structure now occupied the property. Many former residents had moved away. Some had died. Others remembered the fire but could not recall the name of the woman who rescued the children. One former neighbor believed her name was Elena. Another thought she was called Hilda. Someone remembered that she worked in a hospital. Someone else believed she was a home health aide. The information never led anywhere. Daniel eventually accepted that he might never see her again. But he did not stop honoring her. As a fire protection engineer, he worked with schools and apartment owners to improve alarm systems and emergency exits. He became especially passionate about low-income housing. He knew families often remained in unsafe buildings because they had no affordable alternative. During public meetings, he challenged landlords who delayed repairs. "Safety is not a luxury item," he often said. "A child should not need money to deserve a working alarm." Daniel helped change inspection policies in several communities. He also created a small scholarship in his mother's name for students raised by single parents. Although his career was successful, Daniel rarely spoke publicly about the woman who saved him. The story felt too personal. Then his family applied for Family Feud. Angela loved the show. Their daughters, Simone and Leah, watched clips online. Daniel's sister Kayla, now a pediatric nurse, believed the Brooks family could win. Daniel disagreed. "We can barely agree on where to eat," he said. "How are we going to agree with 100 strangers?" Kayla smiled. "We survived sharing one bathroom with 5 cousins. We can survive Steve Harvey." The family sent an audition video. They were selected. Daniel saw the trip as a chance to celebrate Aunt Patricia's 70th birthday. Patricia had raised them after the fire and had recently surgery. Appearing together on television felt like a joyful way to honor her. The opposing family was the Morales family from New Jersey. Their team included Helen, her 2 sons, a daughter-in-law, and a granddaughter. Helen had retired after working more than 40 years in rehabilitation care. Her family described her as brave, stubborn, and incapable of ignoring a person in need. They did not mention the apartment fire in their application. Helen herself rarely discussed it. For years, local newspapers had called her a hero. She disliked the word. She believed she had simply responded to children who needed help. The rescue had also created tension inside her own home. Her sons had spent years afraid that their mother might risk her life again. Helen did not want the fire to become the only story people knew about her. She kept the burns on her hands covered in photographs and changed the subject whenever someone praised her. She had tried to learn what happened to Daniel and Kayla. By the time she recovered, they had moved away. The hospital could not provide information. She knew their mother had died, but she did not know where the children had gone. For decades, Helen wondered whether Daniel remembered her. She wondered whether Kayla's lungs had healed. She wondered whether the children had been placed together. She prayed for them every January. Neither Daniel nor Helen knew the other family had been chosen for the same episode. When the taping began, Daniel was focused on the game. Steve introduced the Brooks family first. Daniel explained his work in fire safety. Steve joked that Daniel probably inspected the studio before agreeing to appear. "I checked the exits," Daniel admitted. Steve turned toward the camera. "This man came to play Family Feud and brought a building code." The audience laughed. Then Steve introduced the Morales family. Helen stood at the end of the podium. She smiled and waved. Daniel glanced across the stage. Something about her face disturbed him. He could not explain why. 38 years had changed Helen. Her hair was silver, and age had softened her features. But the crescent-shaped mark remained near her eyebrow. Daniel looked at her hands. Faint burn scars crossed her fingers. His heart began beating faster. He told himself it was impossible. Helen Morales was a common name. The woman he remembered had been young. Memory could create connections that were not real. The first round began. Daniel tried to concentrate. Steve asked, "Name something people check before leaving the house." Daniel's family gave answers such as the stove, the doors, and their pockets. Daniel answered, "Smoke detector." Steve stared at him. "You check the smoke detector every time you leave." "I work in fire safety. You need a vacation." The audience laughed. Daniel looked across the stage again. Helen was laughing too. The sound triggered a memory. He saw broken glass. He felt cold air. He heard the woman telling him to remain behind her. Daniel's hands became damp. During the next round, Helen approached the center podium. Steve asked her about her career. "I worked in rehabilitation care," she said, "helping people recover from injuries." "Yes, that takes a special person." Helen shrugged. "People helped me when I needed it. You pass that kindness forward." Daniel felt the studio disappear around him. Those words matched something Lorraine used to say. Kindness moves forward. He stared at Helen. She noticed. At first, she assumed Daniel was simply being competitive. Then she saw the expression on his face. Steve began reading the question. "Name something a person might run back into a house to." Daniel stopped listening. The word house opened the memory completely. Helen's blue nursing uniform, the broken window, the metal pressed into his hand, the mark near her eyebrow. Daniel stepped away from the podium. "Wait," he said. "Steve, what's happening?" Daniel pointed across the stage. Helen looked confused. "Ma'am," Daniel said, "did you live on Mercer Street in Newark?" Helen's face changed. Her sons turned toward her. "Yes," she answered slowly. "Were you there during an apartment fire in January of 1988? Helen stopped breathing for a moment. The studio became quiet. "Yes." Daniel's sister, Kayla, grabbed the edge of the podium. She understood before anyone else did. Daniel walked toward the center of the stage. Tears filled his eyes. Helen placed both hands over her mouth. Daniel looked directly at her and said the 4 words he had waited nearly 4 decades to speak. "You saved my life." No one moved. Steve stared at Helen. The audience remained silent, as though even applause would disturb the moment. Helen shook her head. "Daniel." Hearing his name in her voice destroyed the final distance between memory and truth. Daniel began crying. "Yes," he said, "I'm Daniel Brooks." Helen stepped away from her family's podium. Her knees weakened. Her oldest son held her arm. "And Kayla?" Helen asked. Daniel pointed toward his sister. Kayla was already crying. "I'm here too." Helen released a sound that was half laugh and half sob. She crossed the stage. Daniel met her in the center. For a few seconds, they stood face to face without touching. Daniel looked at the scars on her hands. I remember these, he whispered. Helen reached up and placed one hand against his cheek. You were so little. Then Daniel wrapped his arms around her. The audience rose. Applause filled the studio, but Daniel and Helen barely heard it. Kayla joined them. She held Helen with the same arms that had once been wrapped inside her coat. You carried me, Kayla said. Helen touched her hair. You were 5. You remembered us. Every year. The Morales and Brooks families began crying together. Steve stepped away from the podium and removed his glasses. He wiped his eyes. I need somebody to explain this to me, he said, because we just went from Family Feud to something else entirely. The families gathered at center stage. Daniel opened his jacket and removed a small chain from around his neck. Attached to it was the St. Christopher medal. Helen saw it and covered her mouth again. You kept it. For 38 years. She reached toward the medal but stopped before touching it. My mother gave me that. You gave it to me at the hospital. I thought it was gone. Daniel placed the medal in her hand. I tried to find you. Helen closed her fingers around it. I tried to find you, too. Steve looked at the production team. No one had planned the reunion. The casting staff had known Daniel survived a childhood fire because it appeared in his family biography. They knew Helen had once helped rescue children from a building because her granddaughter briefly mentioned her bravery. But no one had connected the two stories. The families had been placed on the same episode by coincidence. Steve shook his head. People use the word coincidence, he said, but some things are too exact for me. The audience applauded. Steve asked Daniel to explain what happened. Daniel described the night of the fire. He spoke about the failed alarm, the trapped bedroom, and the woman who climbed through the window. He explained that his mother died in a separate accident while returning home. Helen lowered her head. I was so sorry when I heard about Lorraine, she said. You knew my mother. Not well, but she loved you both. Anyone could see that. Daniel nodded. She told us not to act grown when we needed help. I didn't understand until you came through that window. Helen looked at him. You were protecting your sister. I was terrified. Being brave does not mean you are not terrified. It means love becomes more important than the fear. Steve repeated the sentence quietly. Love becomes more important than fear. He looked. Somebody needs to write that down. Daniel then explained his career in fire safety. He told Helen about the buildings he had helped improve and the policies he had worked to change. You didn't only save me that night, he said. Every safe building I have helped design started with what you did. Helen shook her head. No, son. You built that life. I could not have built anything if you had not carried me out. Helen looked toward her sons. For years, they had struggled with their mother's decision to enter the fire. Her oldest son, Raphael, stepped forward. I need to say something, he told Daniel. Daniel turned toward him. I was 12 when my mother ran into that building. I was angry with her for years. Helen looked surprised. Raphael continued. I loved her, but I could not understand why she risked leaving us without a mother. Every time I heard people call her a hero, part of me wanted to ask whether her own children mattered. Helen's eyes filled with pain. Raphael took her hand. I never told you because I felt ashamed. You were a child, Helen said. I know, but today I finally see the rest of the story. He looked at Daniel and Kayla. You grew up. You became a man who protects other families. Your sister became a nurse. My mother's decision did not end at that window. Raphael embraced Daniel. For years, I only saw what we might have lost. Today, I can see what the world gained. Steve turned away and wiped his face again. Several audience members were openly crying. Daniel's Aunt Patricia stepped forward. She had remained quiet until then. She looked at Helen. I raised these children after their mother died, Patricia said. I watched Daniel wake from nightmares. I watched Kayla struggle to breathe whenever she smelled smoke. I wanted to thank you, but we had no name. Helen took Patricia's hands. You gave them a home. You gave them the chance to reach it. The two women embraced. The division between the competing families disappeared. The score on the board no longer mattered. Steve asked whether the families wanted to continue playing. Daniel laughed through his tears. I don't even remember the question. Steve looked at the card. I believe I asked what someone might run back into a house to get. Helen raised her hand. A child. The board revealed that child or pet was the #1 answer. The audience erupted. Steve stared at the board. You cannot write this. The game continued, but the atmosphere had changed. The Brooks and Morales families cheered for each other. Whenever one family gave a good answer, the other applauded. The Morales family eventually won the main game. Before Fast Money began, Helen spoke privately with Steve. She said she wanted the Brooks family to share the opportunity. The rules did not allow members of two families to compete together. Steve spoke with the producers. A special decision was made. The Morales family would play the official fast money round, but both families would receive a shared donation for a cause they selected together. Helen and her granddaughter scored enough points to win. Confetti fell. Helen did not run toward her own family first. She walked to Daniel. "We won this together," she said. After the taping, the family spent hours talking backstage. Daniel showed Helen photographs of his wife, daughters, career, and fire safety projects. Kayla explained that she had become a pediatric nurse partly because she remembered the calm way Helen held her during the rescue. Helen introduced them to her children and grandchildren. She told Daniel about the note she had left at the hospital. "I never received it," he said. "I wrote that you had been very brave. I told you not to let that night make your world small." Daniel looked down. "For a long time it did. What changed? I realized fear could either control every room I entered or teach me how to protect the people inside it." Helen smiled, understood the message without reading it. Daniel returned the St. Christopher medal to her. Helen refused to take it. "My mother gave it to me for protection," she said. "It protected you. That means it did its work." Daniel closed her fingers around the medal, then let it come home. Helen thought for a moment. She removed the chain and separated the medal from it. She handed the chain back to Daniel. "Keep this part." "Why?" "So neither of us carries the whole story alone." Daniel accepted it. When the episode aired, viewers responded immediately. The clip of Daniel saying, "You saved my life," spread around the world. But the reunion produced more than a viral moment. People began asking questions about the apartment fire. Daniel's professional organization reviewed the original reports. They discovered that tenants had submitted repeated safety complaints before the disaster. The building owner had ignored several repair notices. The alarm system had not been properly maintained. Although too much time had passed for legal action, the story created a national conversation about fire safety in older rental buildings. Daniel and Helen decided to use the attention to create something practical. With help from both families and several nonprofit organizations, they established the Open Window Initiative. Its purpose was simple: help low-income families obtain working smoke alarms, fire escape plans, and emergency safety inspections. The name came from the window Helen had broken to reach Daniel and Kayla. Daniel designed the technical program. Kayla led health education. Helen spoke to communities about the responsibility neighbors had toward one another. Raphael organized volunteers. The Morales and Brooks families, who had entered the studio as opponents, became partners. Their first project took place in Newark. Volunteers installed alarms in more than 200 apartments. They also provided fire extinguishers, emergency ladders, and multilingual safety guides. During the launch event, Daniel stood outside a newly renovated apartment building. Helen stood beside him. "This woman climbed through a window to save two children she barely knew," Daniel told the crowd. "We cannot ask everyone to perform that kind of rescue, but we can make sure fewer people ever need to." Helen then spoke. "Heroism should not be the first safety plan," she said. "Working alarms, responsible landlords, clear exits, and neighbors who pay attention should come first." The statement became central to the initiative's work. 1 year after their reunion, the two families returned to Family Feud for a special update. Steve welcomed them onto the stage together. There were no separate podiums. Daniel and Helen walked out side by side. The large screen displayed images from the Open Window Initiative. Families were shown testing alarms. Children practiced emergency routes. Older apartment buildings received updated exit signs and fire doors. Steve asked how many homes the organization had reached. Daniel smiled. "More than 3,000 so far." The audience applauded. "And how many fires have those alarms prevented?" Steve asked. "We cannot know," Daniel answered. "That is the strange thing about prevention. When it works, the tragedy never happens." Steve nodded. "That means the best success story is the story nobody has to tell." Helen looked at him. "Exactly." The update also included an emotional visit to the location of the old apartment building. Daniel and Helen stood together on the sidewalk. The original structure had been demolished, but one section of the brick wall had been preserved behind a newer community center. Daniel touched the bricks. "This was the place where I believed my life ended," he said. Helen stood beside him. "But it became the place where another part began." The community center agreed to create a small educational room about housing safety. Lorraine Brooks. Daniel chose his mother's name because he wanted people to remember her as more than a victim. She reported the problems, he explained. She protected us in every way she could. The system failed to listen. Inside the room, one wall displayed Lorraine's message. Money tells you what you can buy. It does not tell you who you are. Another wall displayed the lesson from Helen's mother. A street becomes a community when people stop pretending not to see each other. Between the two messages hung a photograph of Daniel, Kayla, Helen, and both families standing on the Family Feud stage. Steve studied the photograph during the update. Two mothers taught two families how to see human value, he said. Then one woman acted on those lessons when it mattered. Helen looked uncomfortable with the praise. I still do not think of myself as a hero. Steve turned toward her. That is usually how you recognize one. The audience applauded. Daniel's relationship with Helen continued long after the television cameras left. He called her every Sunday. Helen sometimes complained that he worried about her too much. When she mentioned changing a light bulb, Daniel asked whether she had used a safe ladder. When she said she smelled something unusual near her stove, he arranged an inspection from another state. You are treating me like a child, she told him. You climbed an icy fire escape, Daniel replied. You lost the right to criticize anyone for being too careful. Helen laughed. Daniel's daughters began calling her Grandma Helen. Kayla invited her to important family celebrations. During the first Thanksgiving both families shared, Helen sat at the head of the table beside Aunt Patricia. Before the meal, Daniel held up the chain she had returned to him. Helen wore the St. Christopher medal. 38 years ago, Daniel said, this chain and medal were together. Life separated them, but neither part disappeared. He looked around the table. That is what happened to us. Helen reached for his hand. You were never forgotten. Neither were you. The Open Window Initiative continued growing. Within 5 years, it had helped install alarms and improve emergency planning in tens of thousands of homes. The organization also trained young people from low-income neighborhoods in building maintenance and fire safety careers. Daniel believed this part of the mission was especially important. He did not want communities to receive help only from outsiders. He wanted local residents to gain the skills and authority to protect their own families. One scholarship was named for Lorraine. Another was named for Helen. Helen objected when she learned about it. Scholarships are usually named after dead people, she said. Daniel smiled. Then consider this advance notice. She hit his arm. The scholarship supported young nursing assistants, emergency workers, and safety inspectors who demonstrated unusual commitment to their communities. Each recipient received a small replica of the St. Christopher medal. On the back were 4 engraved words. You saved my life. The words no longer belonged only to Daniel. They represented every moment when one person's courage, attention, or kindness changed another person's future. Years later, Steve Harvey was asked about the most unexpected moment he had witnessed on Family Feud. He spoke about Daniel and Helen. I was standing there trying to run a game show, he said. Then this man looked across the stage and recognized the woman who carried him through a fire almost 40 years earlier. Steve paused. The part that stayed with me was not only that she saved him, it was what he did with the life she saved. Daniel had become a protector. Kayla had become a nurse. Helen's children had learned to understand the full meaning of their mother's decision. Two families had turned a chance reunion into safer homes for thousands of strangers. The real legacy. Helen had once believed her rescue ended when Daniel and Kayla reached the ground. She later understood that an act of courage does not always end where it happens. It travels through the people who survive it. Daniel often said Helen saved more than one 9-year-old boy. She saved the husband he later became. She saved the father who raised 2 daughters. She saved the engineer who challenged unsafe housing. She saved every future act of service he would perform. Helen always answered the same way. I opened a window. You decided what to do with the life on the other side. On the 10th anniversary of their reunion, both families returned to the community center in Newark. Children from the neighborhood performed safety demonstrations. Former scholarship recipients described their careers. A young fire inspector explained that the Open Window Initiative had paid for his training after his father lost his job. A nursing student said Helen's story taught her that caring for people sometimes began before they entered a hospital. At the end of the event, Daniel stood beside Helen near the preserved brick wall. Helen was now 78. She walked with a cane and became tired more easily, but her voice remained strong. Daniel asked whether she ever thought about that night. Not as much as I used to, she said. Why? For years, I wondered whether I had made the right decision. I knew I saved you, but I also knew I could have left my sons without a mother. She looked toward Raphael and his brother. They had to carry the fear created by my choice. Raphael stepped closer. We understand now. Helen nodded. A right decision can still have painful consequences. Life is complicated that way. Daniel looked at the families gathered around them. Would you do it again? Helen stared at him. You already know the answer. Yes. If I heard you crying, I would still climb. Daniel embraced her. This time, the hug was not between a frightened child and his rescuer. It was between two older friends whose lives had become connected by one impossible night. The family feud question that triggered their reunion was never completed in the normal way. But Steve later said the best answer had already been standing on the stage. Name something a person might run back into a house to get. A child, a stranger, a future, a life that still had work to do. Daniel had spent 38 years searching for the woman who saved him. Helen had spent those same years wondering whether the boy from the burning apartment had survived. Then two families stood across from each other under bright studio lights. Daniel saw the small mark near Helen's eyebrow. He saw the scars on her hands. He remembered the broken window. And four simple words closed a distance that time had failed to erase. You saved my life. Those words silenced everyone because they carried more than gratitude. They carried the frightened voice of a 9-year-old boy. They carried the courage of a young mother who refused to look away. They carried Lorraine's love, Patricia's sacrifice, Kayla's healing, and the complicated fear of Helen's sons. They carried thousands of homes made safer because one life had been given another chance. But years later, when Daniel and Helen spoke about that moment, they no longer focused on silence. They focused on what came after it. The embrace, the families joining together, the alarms installed, the students trained, the futures protected. Daniel had finally thanked the woman who entered the fire for him. Helen had finally seen the man he became. And both of them learned that sometimes the greatest answer on Family Feud is not written on the board. Sometimes it is standing across the stage, waiting to